In the roots of fantasy, the genre was about stepping into an entire civilization. In addition to following a hero on a quest, you studied the maps, learned the histories, and obsessed over the tiny details of imaginary cultures. Tolkien, as the gold standard for this, even engineered languages for his races. These were worlds built to be lived in, layer after layer of lore just waiting to be uncovered. But lately, that kind of storytelling feels like it's getting harder to find. Fewer authors seem willing to spend years crafting every corner of a fictional society. So, what happened? Why does it feel like deep world building is slowly fading out of the genre?
In this video, we're gonna unpack exactly why world-building driven fantasy isn't as dominant as it used to be. We'll look at what made it captivating in the first place, why it's becoming rare, and what that says about where fantasy is headed next. And stick around because the reasons why go beyond just shorter attention spans. It's about how internet, publishing, and even storytelling itself have all shifted in ways that are reshaping the genre and media consumption as a whole. So let's get to it.
Fantasy has always been a genre of imagination, but world-building driven fantasy takes it to another level. These are the stories where the setting is the backdrop but also the star. The geography matters. The political systems feel real, the religions, economies, and even the languages have history and depth. You're living in a world with centuries of culture behind every decision, every city, and every conflict. The goal is also to give readers the feeling that this world would keep turning, even if the main characters disappear tomorrow. What makes world-building driven fantasy stand out is the sheer weight of detail. These are the books with maps you actually study, appendices you flip back to, and lore that stretches so deep you start to feel like you've earned a degree just by finishing the series. You'll find complex societies with their own traditions and customs, and conflicts that exist because of centuries of rivalries, cultural divides, and political intrigue. You can see it in The Lord of the Rings, where Tolkien created entire languages and myth. You can feel it in A Song of Ice and Fire, where entire chapters are just characters navigating the consequences of dynastic politics. And then there's Malazan Book of the Fallen, where every corner of the world carries the weight of ancient, forgotten wars.
These stories are built to take their time. The joy is more than just the battles and the character arcs. It's in seeing how everything connects, how the economy of a distant city affects a war halfway across the continent, how an ancient prophecy echoes through modern politics. World-building driven fantasy invites readers who love piecing together the big picture, who wants to sit with a world and understand how it works from the ground up. And that's why so many of us fell in love with this sort of stories in the first place. But lately, they're becoming less frequent. Authors are shifting their focus, publishers are looking for faster, tighter narratives, and audiences aren't always willing to commit to that level of depth. Why does it feel like world-building driven fantasy is slowly disappearing from the spotlight? That's exactly what we're gonna unpack next. But before we do that, if you're enjoying the video, I'd ask you to like and leave a comment. Everything here on the channel is free, including our Discord server. So the best way to support it, it's by just helping us with appeasing the unrelenting algorithm gods. It really makes a difference. But now let's move on with the video.
So why are we seeing fewer of these sprawling, deeply built worlds in fantasy today? It's not because readers suddenly stopped loving big, immersive settings, but the landscape of storytelling has shifted, and world-building heavy fantasy is feeling the impact from multiple sides. From how we consume media to how authors create, there are some clear reasons why these massive epics aren't taking center stage like they used to. In a world of TikToks, Instagram Reels, and YouTube Shorts, patience for slow burn storytelling is thinning out. The days when readers would happily sit through 100 pages of lore and backstory before the real action started are fading. Today's audiences often expect a hook within the first chapter, sometimes the first page. Big, intricate worlds take time to unfold, they need space to breathe. But when competing against bingeable shows, viral clips, and fast-paced, character-driven books, deeply layered world building can feel like too much of an investment. It's why adaptations like the Wheel of Time streamline or outright cut dense lore sections to keep viewers engaged. The assumption is that people won't stick around long enough for the detail.
We're bombarded with so much content every single day. We are bombarded with so much content every single day that committing to 1,000-page tome feels like a luxury. The problem is, when we rush past the details, the worlds themselves start feeling flatter. The depth that made them magical in the first place gets sacrificed for speed.
There was a time when a single fantasy series could dominate global culture. Harry Potter midnight releases, Game of Thrones watch parties. The internet felt like it revolved around these shared experiences. But now, the online world has splintered into a million niche communities. Algorithms push us into personalized bubbles, and it's rare for a story to capture everyone at once. For authors, that changes the math. Why pour a decade into creating the next great fantasy world if it's only going to reach a small corner of the internet? The chance of building the next cultural juggernaut feels lower than ever.
And this fragmentation hurts visibility, but also motivation, of course. When the reward for building something huge and complex might be just a quiet, niche audience instead of worldwide recognition, it's no wonder some writers are choosing smaller, more intimate stories. It's safer, it's faster, and honestly, it pays the bills.
Modern fantasy has shifted its focus. Today, it's often less about vast worlds and more about sharp, intimate character arcs. Books like the Poppy War or the Broken Earth trilogy still have amazing settings, but they don't spend pages lovingly describing architecture or detailing trade systems. Instead, they center emotional journeys, trauma, and survival. The world exists to serve the character's story, not the other way around. And for many readers, that's exactly what they want. They'd rather explore the depths of a character's mind than the intricacies of ancient treaties or royal bloodlines.
Look, character-driven fantasy is incredible. I love it. But when the focus shifts so fully to the individual, sometimes the world itself can start to feel like wallpaper. It's just a theater backdrop for internal monologues and personal drama. And that's great until you realize you're craving a world that feels like it could exist without the protagonists at all. And at some point, if the setting doesn't matter at all, what's even the point of writing your story in the fantasy genre, right? Just pick some other genre.
Writing massive epics filled with layered history, cultures, and systems, it's both creatively demanding and financially risky. Big, multi-book series take years to write, edit, and market. For publishers, that's a huge investment with no guarantee of return, especially if attention spans are shrinking and markets are fragmenting. Meanwhile, readers are more hesitant to dive into 10-book commitments. Standalones or tight trilogies are safer bets, which means fewer of those sprawling encyclopedic worlds are getting greenlit.
And again, here's the thing. If you're an author trying to make a living, are you really going to gamble on spending the next 15 years of your life writing the next Malazan? Or are you going to write something smaller, punchier, and easier to sell? The reality is, most writers don't have the luxury of building the next massive, lore-filled empire anymore. They need to feed themselves.
Authors might also be spread thin these days. In today's industry, authors are expected to be full-time marketers, social media managers, and sometimes even merch designers. They're running Patreons, podcasts, and YouTube channels just to stay visible. Pouring all your creative energy into a single, massive world feels nearly impossible when you're juggling a dozen other projects. It's easier and often smarter to write shorter stories or experiment with new genres rather than committing everything to one enormous setting.
Imagine spending 10 years on one world while also trying to post daily on social media, engage with fans, and pitch adaptations. The industry is built to reward flexibility and speed, not the slow, meticulous craft of creating an entire fantasy civilization. And that takes a toll on world building. After all of this said, what does that mean for the future of fantasy? Is this a bad thing or a good thing?
World-building heavy fantasy may not dominate pop culture the way it did during the era of the Lord of the Rings films or Game of Thrones, but that doesn't mean it's vanished. In fact, it's thriving, just not always in the spotlight. Today, we're seeing some of the most impressive, detailed worlds emerge from indie publishing, where authors have the freedom to build sprawling epics without worrying about mainstream marketability. Tabletop games like Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder have become havens for collaborative world building, allowing entire communities to help shape living, breathing settings together. Lore-heavy video games like Elden Ring, Disco Elysium, and Hollow Knight pull players into worlds that rival anything on the page, while YouTube channels dedicated to deep lore breakdowns keep niche audiences engaged for hours. The passion for big, intricate worlds is absolutely still there. It's just moved into new spaces with audiences willing to follow.
And as the genre evolves, we're kind of seeing a new balance emerge. Writers are experimenting with stories that combine the depth of classic world building with the emotional pull of tight, character-driven arcs. Instead of pausing the plot to dump a history lesson, they thread the lore directly into the stakes of the characters. So the idea is not about recreating another Silmarillion from scratch. It's about making a world that feels vast and lived in while still keeping the story moving. The future of world building might not be massive multi-volume epics anymore, but focused throughout worlds that feel just as alive, just as immersive, and just as unforgettable. So, is world-building heavy fantasy really dead? Honestly, I don't think so. It's just shifting, finding new formats, new audiences, and new ways to thrive. Maybe you're not all reading the same giant fantasy tomes anymore, but there are still incredible worlds being built out there if you know where to look. Yeah, so I do think it would be very unlikely for a world-building heavy fantasy series to reach colossal levels of popularity. There's a niche for everything these days with the internet, so these types of stories still exist. They're probably not gonna break into the mainstream that much.
So, with all of this considered, how can authors strike a balance between having just enough world building to make the world lived in without bogging down the pacing? A well-balanced fantasy story finds the sweet spot between immersion and momentum. It gives you just enough world building to feel lived in and believable, but it doesn't bury you in history lessons before you even care about the characters. Instead of stopping the story to explain an empire's 500-year history, it threads that history into the plot itself, maybe through an old soldier's bitterness about a war lost decades ago, or through a religious festival that hints at deeper political tension. The best world building doesn't feel like an info dump. It feels like you're overhearing pieces of a conversation that invite you to lean in and discover more. The world is deep, but the reader isn't forced to wade through it all at once. One way modern fantasy achieves this balance is by making the world serve the story, not the other way around. A book like The Green Bone Saga by Fonda Lee has rich world building, detailed politics, economic systems, even cultural traditions, but they all directly affect the characters' struggles. You're not learning about trade policies because the author spent 10 years designing them. You're learning because they dictate who gets rich, who stays in power, and who is willing to kill for more influence. The key is that the world is felt rather than just explained. This means dropping lore in bite-sized pieces, using mystery and discovery to make the world feel bigger than what's on the page. Instead of a character reading an entire prophecy, maybe they overhear half of it in a marketplace argument. Instead of describing a city's complex caste system in full, show it through an interaction. A noble dismissing a commoner without a word, or a merchant forced to bribe their way through a checkpoint. It's a shift from telling to showing, and when done well, it makes a world feel just as vast and intricate as the doorstopper epics of the past, but with enough momentum to keep readers hooked. World-building heavy fantasy may not dominate pop culture the way it did before, but that doesn't mean it's vanished. In fact, it's thriving, but in new, more specialized spaces. Indie publishing has become a haven for authors who want to pour years into constructing intricate worlds without the constraints of traditional publishing timelines or commercial expectations. On platforms like Kickstarter and Patreon, readers directly fund these massive passion projects, creating a sustainable ecosystem for niche, lore-obsessed storytelling. Meanwhile, tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons and Blades in the Dark have exploded in popularity, giving players the tools to collaboratively create entire worlds together. Worlds where the lore evolves in real time through the player's actions. And then there are video games where titles like Elden Ring, Disco Elysium, Hollow Knight, and Divinity: Original Sins have set a new gold standard for environmental storytelling, hidden lore, and world building that rewards exploration and curiosity.
Even though world-building heavy fantasy may be dead in mainstream culture for the time being, the appetite for rich, immersive worlds hasn't disappeared. It's just migrated to corners of the internet and gaming culture, where that kind of depth still feels sacred and appreciated. and where audiences are eager to invest their time and energy into worlds they can really sink into. But what do you think? Is world-building heavy fantasy dying? Or is it just evolving? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Also tell me your favorite world-building masterpiece in the comments as well. And hey, if you're into deep lore, maps, and messy stories, make sure to subscribe and join us in Loregeist's Tavern on Discord. It's our free Discord server for fantasy discussion. You can find a link to that on the channel's page. Thanks for watching, and I see you next time.
Come join our Tavern discussion of fantasy storytelling and world building here at Loregeist. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Thanks for watching, and may your tales be ever epic.